Thank you very much. So my name is Sue. I'm, as we said, a user experience consultant, and I specialize in designing complex systems and services. And over the last couple of projects that I've done, I've found myself designing for expert users, which is a rather interesting space to be in. So thank you very much for having me. I know it's close to beer o'clock and it's the afternoon, but today I wanted to share with you the lessons that I've learned in creating and working with design systems for expert users. So I'm going to talk about what an expert user is. I'll show some key examples of how we've designed for them. And then I'll talk about the things that I've learned and what I do. So what do I mean by an expert user? Well, an expert user is part and parcel of an organization's operations in some way. So usually that means they're going to be internal staff. But they may also be a partner. So that could be someone, for example, like a restaurant in a food delivery business such as Deliveroo. Or it could be a middleman, so perhaps a travel agent who's able to sell tickets on Eurostar or on Eurostar's behalf. They'll have some subject matter expertise and knowledge to carry out their role. But perhaps most importantly, they're going to use a digital interface supported by the organization that they're associated with. The key thing to bear in mind is that for the owners of that interface, an expert user is seen as internal staff. And I think this is because we kind of see them as part of the machinery. So throughout this talk, I'll be referring to them as internal staff. How does this affect design systems, though? Well, I wanted to take you on a little journey through time because it's kind of easy to forget how far we've come in relatively short space of time. So from our humble beginnings on DOS and Windows-based systems, and it's kind of hard to imagine using these now, but it wasn't too long ago that we were, and perhaps some of you remember them. And then the dot-com era happened, and we were kind of catapulted into the age of web design. So this is the homepage of Eurostar circa 2005, and sorry about the quality, it's a bit blurry because it's that old. But you can see that by 2010, there's much more functionality as our technical capabilities have expanded. So we've got advanced searching now, it's more inclusive, wheelchair users are able to search for bookings for themselves, and you're not just making a booking, you're also able to now manage your booking online. And we're able to pull in live updates, which is really valuable for customers to see what's happening. And similarly, of course, as a lot of people have touched on today, the brand has been able to evolve. And we spent a lot of time and money improving design. And by 2019, we now have these really complex digital systems. And we're quite focused now, I think, on moving into how do we support our design systems? How do we support our evolving digital needs? Which are basically there to give our customers the best experience possible. So I want you to imagine that you might be at St. Pancras International Station and you see a queue like this. And there's a train delay, so this isn't uncommon with Eurostar. And as you can see, it's pretty scary and it can back up a lot of the station. And it's not a small station. Now I want you to imagine that you're facing this queue and you're the person responsible for reaccommodating that entire train of probably quite angry and anxious customers. And if you remember this slide I showed you earlier, I can tell you that that's the system you'd be doing it on. And you'd be using screens like this, 1024 by 768 with zero ability to adjust contrast. And I want to say that it's not just Eurostar, they're actually doing a really good job with their digital innovation. There are many, many others in the same position with their internal staff. So these are two more from my Hall of Fame. They're both in government. So the one on the left is a case management system that judges use to manage their casework. And the one on the right is what the Food Standards Agency use. And for those who don't know, they keep our food safe. So they basically get signals from all over about possible food incidents, and then they investigate them. And they will issue alerts, so perhaps an allergy alert, or they might ask a business to recall their products. I think the point is that we've been so customer-focused, we've forgotten about the people who make the organization tick, and often the people who are closest to the end users. So yes, we've come a long way, but not if you're internal staff. It's kind of like we left them back in 1995 with this happy guy, who was clearly very excited to get his hands on Windows 95. And back in the day, it was a huge deal, Windows 95. People queued for ages. There was a keynote speech, much like Apple do today. I think Bill Gates bought the rights to a Rolling Stone song, and Jay Leno was involved. But back then, everyone was sort of equal. We all had a piece of the pie. And then customer experience became a focus, and we just left our internal users there, and they never got to bridge the gap. I often feel like when I'm designing for them that I'm on the B team or the B design team. There's no money, there's no time. I often don't get a UI designer to work with. And I'm told, don't make it pretty, it's just about being functional. And there's this mentality that design just doesn't matter as much if you're internal, because we can force them to use it, and if they don't use it correctly, we'll either train them somehow or we'll fine them, and I've had that. So unlike customers, internal users don't get the best experience possible, and we don't have design systems for them. So where do we go from here? Because the inevitable is going to happen at some point. Business is going to want to transition off of their legacy system, or they're going to need to build something new because they're expanding and there's new functionality. How do you design interfaces for internal stuff when there's nothing to draw on? And a lot of our other speakers have touched on this. And you're basically having to transition these guys 25 years into the future overnight. So the first question I get asked is, can't we just use our existing design system? And often the types of organizations that I'm involved in have quite established customer-facing design systems, or supporting their customer-facing systems. So this seems like a kind of very sensible choice. A lot of research and money's gone into it. It's the same product or service, and obviously the internal staff are going to be quite close to the users. So I'm just curious to know how many of you might make that choice or think that your organization would, like by show of hands. Okay, a couple. I want to show you a few examples of people who've done this. So this is a food delivery business that I worked with, and that's their customer-facing app. And this is their app that delivery drivers use. So you can see that they've basically kind of lifted and shifted a lot of their existing design system onto there, and it's nice and clean, clear calls to actions, not too busy, and it's obviously consistent, so they've been able to reuse a lot of stuff. So it's a Friday night, and you fancy a takeaway, and you kind of on your couch comfortably scrolling, trying to choose between chicken chow mein and Peking duck, which, let's face it, isn't an easy choice. And, eventually you get to your choice and make your order, place your order, job done, back to the latest beheading on Game of Thrones. Meanwhile, here's your driver. So pretty different experience for them. The weather might be horrendous. We often tend to order food when the weather's bad. They're going to have a restricted view because they're wearing a helmet. The screen's not as close. It's mounted on their handlebars, and they're wearing thick gloves. And there's a lot of competing stimuli around them. And not only that, they're under horrendous time pressure. So not just to get the delivery to you, but many of those apps time out in terms of how quick you have to accept your order. And all the food delivery business apps tend to work the same for drivers. So the question to ask is this really the right UI for him or her? I'd argue that it probably isn't, because it's probably better we give them voice control, that we try to minimize the amount of interactions that they need to take, and ultimately they should be using a map-based system because that's what they use anyway, and it's pretty hard to think in terms of postcodes. But most importantly of all, it's dangerous to touch the screen. It's actually illegal. And it's dangerous on a bike to even be glancing at a screen because things happen much faster than they do in a car. So sort of begs the question a little bit, perhaps, of are we inadvertently encouraging dangerous behavior through a design system? So you might be thinking, okay, well, perhaps that was a research issue. What about a really well-established design system? So this is the government's design system, and we spoke about it a bit earlier. And I really like it because it has a lot of stuff that a good design system should, particularly also research, which is often missing from design systems. And here's what we did in a portion of a kind of system that the government were building to digitize the legal system end to end. So what they want to do is allow you to, for example, if you needed to get a divorce, you could apply online, and the entire process from application to organizing hearings, perhaps even having hearings, judge making decisions, etc., would happen online. And this part is where a judge would go to make an order about how your finances would be separated. So we followed the GDS principles for this, which is kind of like one thing at a time. It's form-based. It's very instructional. The feedback, though, that we got from judges was that their work is not a tick box exercise and they're not admin. And it kind of made me think that, we were sort of misinterpreting the work of the judiciary by thinking that simplifying it in this way was the right thing to do. And this is kind of because that design system is geared for citizen-facing application forms. And it's the right thing to do for citizens, but it's taken away the essence of what judges do. And similarly, the check your answers pattern, which is slightly adapted here, is great for citizens because you're applying for your passport, you're able to say, this is the information I've provided, is it correct, and submit it before you fail it later on. But are we really saying to judges, check your answers? I don't know. Do we need to give them a confirmation step? Yes. I think the issue here was, and it was mentioned earlier, so that the process in this kind of work is that you go through assessments. But we didn't have to go through an assessment because we were designing for internal users. And those internal users included lawyers that weren't actually a part of, they really are external. So I think there was a bias towards a citizen-facing design system, and there wasn't an avenue to challenge that within the design community. They were, very entrenched, I suppose, in this design system, which made a lot of sense. But because this was something brand new, it may have needed some channel to assess whether all of these things were fit for purpose. So if we accept that we do need a new design system to support what we're developing, then perhaps surely some of it can be used, say, if the tasks are the same. So this is what customers see when searching for a Eurostar train. And this is the redesign of what internal staff will see. And if you put them side by side, you can see that they're really quite different, although it's the same task. And that's because the requirements are so different. So customers need to be able to go onto Eurostar's website and find a train on a site that they're not very familiar with. It's very spacious, and it's got this concept of doing one thing at a time. But the staff have a completely different requirement because they are a proxy of the system, and they need to be able to almost act as a search for customers, and they need to be able to have a way to access all the information really quickly without having to do complex setups, and be able to provide that back so that they can give them different price options and seat availability, and they can also accommodate customers changing their mind, which they will do when calling in or at the station. So changing currency, destinations, dates, times, etc. And the last example I wanted to give you was anecdotal. So I didn't work with these guys, but I was buying a dishwasher recently, which is the best thing I've ever done, and highly recommended. And the assistant serving me, her colleague came up to her and she had a sort of bag around her neck. They both did. And she took it off. It was the end of the day, and she said, "Can you please hand this in for me?" And as we were kind of walking to do that, the person helping me said, "This is our iPads, and they make us carry these around, but I never use it because my phone is faster." And I, kind of asked her what that all meant, being a UX designer, I'm curious. And what she kind of meant was, obviously, it's not faster, it's the same content, it's the same internet connection, but it's just much easier for her to use her phone, because you can imagine trying to stand on the shop floor with an iPad in your hand, which is too big for your hand, and then try type in an awkward serial number to check catalog somewhere with your other hand, or try do it like that. And the customer doesn't really need to see the screen in most cases, because you are just doing things like checking catalog. And I think it's worth mentioning that form factor is one of the key underpinnings of any design system, but I'd argue that it's often an afterthought. That decision is sometimes made ahead of time, and we don't necessarily even know the reasons why. So, can we use our customer-facing design systems for internal staff? In my experience, the answer is generally no. So the challenge is then, and a lot of people have touched on this today, how do you create one whilst building the thing that you need to build? So here's what I've learned and what I do. The key thing for me, and sort of key takeaway of this talk is inputs are as important as outputs. I often feel like these are missing in design systems, but they give the team a single source of truth to draw on, which is really important early on. And it stops in unnecessary exploration and reinventing the wheel later on. And it's also your history of evidence-based design and decision-making. And yeah, I would say you start with this, and then these can become incorporated into your design system later on. It goes without saying you need to start with research. We can't assume that we know what internal staff need. So whatever amount of research you can do, I would really recommend doing it, even if it is guerrilla style. And capture it somehow, somewhere for everyone to see. So in this case, I went and identified various different types of restaurants, went in and observed them, and then was able to pull out patterns and break it into a kind of task analysis. And I shared this in Trello with the entire team, which was great, but you don't want your research to be dead and buried either. So I like to link my research into user stories in my prototype, which I use as a single source of truth during the design phase. So I have a version history, which has what I might have done in that iteration of the prototype. And then I link through to the user stories. These ones are from the government example. And you can link those further back into Jira tickets, for example. And it's just a nice way to ensure that research is used in development and that it's really useful for product owners, because talking to that buy-in, they can show how they're addressing user needs. And it's great if it's only a click away. If it takes a lot of work to get to your research, you're probably not going to look at it. So like I say, I use my prototyping as my single source of truth. The other thing I think is really important to put in there is the information architecture. So it's pretty difficult for developers to just build off wireframes and prototypes at the early stage especially. So this is a great way you can incorporate decisions and what happens and how the business rules get affected within your single source of truth, however you want to do that. I like to make it interactive so that you can actually click through into one of those and see the page. And in that way, you have different ways to access this information. It could be you step through the prototype and see how it works, or it could be that you're just using the map and you get it that way. And you can also use this to show change. So in this example here, it's the same type of journey, but the box in blue shows new functionality that's been added as we've iterated this service. And I've also been able to kind of highlight to the team where there'll be impacts in our existing journeys, our existing sections or pages, which is really quite useful as well. Obviously, no design system is complete without UI components and elements. But at this stage, you're not going to have a fully fledged one. So this is something I did for Eurostar because we were a very small team working under immense timeline pressures. And I didn't have a UI designer. So I basically described all the properties that we would need for our components, colors, sizing, spacing, the grid system, etc. And I just put it in my prototype so that it was a way that everyone could come and access it because it's on the net, on the web, so it's live and it's the single source of truth. One nice thing that some prototyping systems do now, such as Axure, is they kind of do a little bit of what Zeppelin does, so you can hover over the code. And I know this isn't like the end stage, but for what we needed to do at the time, it was great because the devs could come in and reference this and build against it whilst we were creating this new booking management system for Eurostar staff. And then the QA team could come in and check what dev were doing against it. And we didn't have to spend a lot of time setting stuff up. It was really agile, nimble, and quick. And then lastly, to have a single source of truth in your design system about decision-making. It's really great because when somebody later on down the line comes and says to you, why did you do X? You can point to where that decision was made. And if you don't have this history, then later on, when you've left the organization or things have really evolved or it's really grown and expanded, and people want to challenge a pattern, they don't really have anything to reference on or against. So with this kind of audit, if you will, you could come in and see what's been done. So I'd suggest including testing in here as well and feedback. And you could say, okay, we've actually done that. It didn't work, but it's justified doing it again, perhaps because the context was different, or maybe you decide that actually, there are various reasons why it wouldn't or should be done. So that's really, really useful to have. I guess you're probably all sitting here wondering, and we're all advocates of design systems, but the organization itself isn't always. So how do you sort of speak to that return on investment? Designing new systems for internal staff and design systems of a whole will have an impact on the return on investment. So in this case, the Eurostar current system that you see over there took 3 weeks to learn. And that's because you're typing in code, so you have to know those codes. It's like the old airline systems that when you went to the travel agent and you asked to change your seat and they spent 10 minutes clicking away and you thought they were hacking the system. They were just typing in codes to get information. We were able to prove in testing sessions that new staff to Eurostar were able to come in and do complex tasks without any instruction or any setup. Things like upgrading multi-leg journeys, doing complex exchanges, all of that kind of stuff, unassisted. So not only will it mean a reduction in training time and costs, especially if your organization is, not just in one location, but it also means you can retire a legacy system, which could be expensive to maintain. There are other opportunity costs. So for example, if somebody's retiring or leaving the organization and they're the only people who have that knowledge, you don't run that risk. And it also means, of course, that you can move forwards and have a system that will allow you to create future flexibility and scale. So to sum up, design for internal users, not at them. Inputs are as important as outputs. And start your design system during the design phase. And most of all, remember that internal users are people too. Thank you very much.